And now I'd like to ask the members of our next panel, the technology panel, to join me on the stage. We have 3 speakers here today to discuss the impact of technologies on distracted driving. In our high-tech mobile devices, if our high-tech mobile devices are making us more distracted behind the wheel, are there new technologies that can help stop the distractions and make us safer on the road? Well, Jake Nelson is here today. He heads up AAA's Traffic Safety Advocacy and Research Division. He's an epidemiologist who brings a scientific mind to analyzing data to develop effective ways to keep drivers safe. Jake has been working with researchers to test voice recognition technologies in new vehicles and to compare how they affect drivers' attention. And I had the privilege in August, AAA sponsored a great distracted driving summit here in Austin, and Jake came in town for that conference and had a chance to be on the program with him. And again, we welcome you back and glad you're here today, and we look forward to hearing from you. Our next speaker after Jake will be Dr. David Kidd. He's a senior research scientist at the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. His research extends to many types of advanced vehicle technologies and their effects on safety and driver behavior. Also had the chance working with Dr. Kidd at the Governor's Highway Safety Association. I was moderating a panel on teen driving, and he had some great insight in terms of what's going on with vehicle technologies and our teen drivers. And so, David, welcome to Austin. Look forward to hearing from you. And then our third speaker will be Rick Alexander. He's the Director of Transportation Safety and Research at Mobisoft Infotech. Rick has spent more than 25 years in the high-tech industry, and his recent work focuses on developing mobile applications aimed at improving highway safety. So he's going to be sharing with us some results from a pilot test of a new mobile app meant to discourage teens from using their smartphones while driving. And I happened to be at the conference when we kicked this off, and I look forward to hearing more about that. So it was real exciting to be at this teen conference, and when you talked about your program and asked teens to start signing up, it was incredible to see the response rate of teens that were very interested in this app that he's put together. So I'm looking forward to sharing that information with you. And once our speakers finish up, they're each going to take 10 to 12 minutes to go through and talk about what programs and information that they're involved with. And then we're going to open it up and have a time for questions and answers and talk more in detail about a lot of the efforts that they're involved with. And so, Jake, I'm going to turn it over to you to start off our panel.
All right, thank you. We've got the slide advancer here. So I'm kind of like a shark. If I stop moving, I sink. So I'm going to walk around a little bit. So you've all been through the basics this morning, I assume, and so I'm not going to cover those, but this slide is really just to remind you all that there are 3 sort of forms or contributors to distracted driving. You know, the manual, hands on the wheel, the eyes off the road, and then not having your mind on the task of driving. The visual is probably the most accepted form of distracted driving, and the one where the most effort has gone into from industry players in particular in trying to address it through a variety of technologies. And the one that has received the least amount of effort to address is the mental or cognitive piece. And so that is the work that AAA and the AAA Foundation tackled first. And that's the reason why, because it wasn't getting the attention that the topic deserved. We started looking at technologies that the automakers were building into the dashboard to make it easier for people to interact with their phones in the way that they would have done manually if not for this technology. And so in the beginning of this technology becoming more commonplace in vehicles, there was a lot of advertising that went along with it from the automakers, actually marketing these technologies as making you safer, saving lives, keep your hands on the wheel and your eyes on the road, and safe behind the wheel, essentially. Those commercials don't play anymore online because those aren't credible statements to make, which you'll learn here in just a moment. So one of the things that we did when we started looking into this research was borrow the methods that were used 30 years ago to help develop the Apache helicopter in such a way that the demands on the pilot were as low as possible so that he or she who was flying the helicopter could focus on evasive maneuvers and that kind of thing in a battle environment. Talk about being distracted while operating a vehicle. And this same set of research informed the sterile cockpit rule that now the airline industry, the commercial airline industry, has to abide by. So that period of time during takeoff and landing when all technologies, everything goes away, no one is communicating with the pilots, and they're focused on the task at hand, which also, interestingly, is the only time that pilots are actually really flying the plane. So that is sort of the methods that we use to study the same sort of thing, driver workload, in the cockpit of a vehicle instead of a helicopter or an airplane. So we did a variety of phases of this work. We've been doing it for 5 years now. And the very first year, some of our key findings, there were 3 core sort of sets of findings here. The first was that cognitive or mental distraction is real and it can be measured. And of course, we knew this because it had been done before in the Apache and behind in cockpits of airplanes, but no one had ever really studied this in the driving environment before. And industry in particular was very resistant to accepting the fact that mental distraction was real. Or if it were real, it didn't really contribute in any meaningful or measurable way to the propensity of drivers to get into a crash because they were distracted in some way. So we addressed that in this context. Also, the second 2 bullets here are things that we knew from previous research done by other people, not AAA. And it was good, as is the case in any research, to be able to prove again and to reproduce findings. And so in this case, we're able to show that cell phone use impairs a driver's ability to operate a motor vehicle, and that impairment exists whether you're hands-free or handheld. So the results in our research were the same for both handheld or hands-free phones. And then lastly here, that speech-based in-vehicle technologies using voice recognition technology was some of the worst, at least in that phase of the study. So using voice commands to do things like tune the radio, place phone calls, and go through your text messages actually overloaded the driver more than doing it manually. And this is the same technology that industry had put into the vehicle to say, hey, keep your hands on the wheel and your eyes on the road and you'll be safer as drivers. Not necessarily the case. And certainly that wasn't their intention. Their intention was to make drivers safe, naturally. But sometimes there are unintended consequences that are negative for technologies designed to make us safer or to improve the convenience that we want to experience as drivers, for example. And this would be one example of that happening. In phase 2 of the work, we wanted to do a couple things. First, we rated some systems, real technologies and real vehicles, and the results are up here on the screen. A couple things worth pointing out here is that you see driving only. So we're comparing sort of the workload experience, mental workload or cognitive workload experienced by drivers just driving without any other distractions as compared to interacting with the infotainment systems in a variety of vehicles. And it's worth pointing out here that there is a workload associated with driving. Just driving all by itself comes with a cost in terms of distraction. Are there any driver training instructors here? How many decisions do you have to make in a minute driving on average?
It depends on your environment.
I heard over 100.
Over 100.
Yeah, so you're doing a lot of different things. You're monitoring your speed.
You make more decisions in one day than most people make in their jobs in a month.
There you go. So you're monitoring your speed, your position in your lane, where you are on your route, exits, hazards in the roadway. You're doing a lot of different things already, okay? And so there's this notion of multitasking, which actually isn't real. So we can't multitask, although we'll use that term in a really cavalier way. What we're really doing is switching between tasks rapidly, okay? So think about your computer when you or your phone. If you put a ton of apps on it and you've got all these things operating in the background, what happens to your computer or your cell phone? Slows down, right? Because it can't process all that information as quickly as it could if it were doing fewer things. And we're no different as humans. Our brains operate in much the same way. So if we're trying to do too many things at one time and we're switching between a variety of tasks, there is a period of time in between each of those tasks where we're sort of regaining situational awareness. We've sort of left this and now we're going to this and we're trying to figure out, all right, where are we with this task? What's going on? And so there's this ramping up period. And that's true whether you're behind the wheel or sitting behind your desk. And then also Mercedes. So most people don't drive a Mercedes, but we included it because we wanted to know if spending top dollar on a vehicle meant that you would have top quality and, in theory, be safer behind the wheel, at least in terms of this technology. And we found that that's not necessarily the case. So spending a lot of money on a car doesn't necessarily mean that the technologies in that car are going to perform better than other lower cost options. The other thing we wanted to do in this phase of the work is try to understand where the workload was coming from. So what was it about these different technologies that made drivers perform differently when using them? And so some of the things that we identified here were, well, first, you got driving alone, and the next one is adjusting or tuning the radio or temperature in the car, all right? And so this is our goal. So if you're gonna interact, use voice commands to do things in your car, like interact with your text messages or to place a call or respond to a call, something like that, it should be no more demanding or distracting than tuning your radio or adjusting the temperature in your car. That seems reasonable, right? Those are things we have to do while driving. And so that is sort of our realistic, reasonable expectation on industry. So that's how that performs in terms of workload. And there is a workload associated with that. But so when we looked at listening to messages and listening and also composing messages, you see that about half of that difference is from composing the message. So if industry partners were interested in reducing the demands on drivers as a result of interacting with these technologies, they could allow them to maybe listen to their text messages or emails, but not respond to those messages while driving. Because what happens when you use a digital voice assistant like Siri to try to transcribe a message? A couple of things. First of all, she does not do a good job at her only job. Some of the messages that I've seen on my phone, embarrassing. It's like, wow, I can't believe I sent that, sorry. And so the second thing is because we know that happens, we look. We look anyway. We don't keep our hands on the wheel and our eyes on the road. We're still gonna check it. And other researchers have looked at that as well. I think there was a research team in Texas that looked at that very issue, and they found that drivers using Siri still looked away from the roadway to verify the accuracy of their message before they sent it because they don't trust the technology because she screws up all the time. Okay? Also here we looked at navigating menus. And so you've got sort of a simple menu and then a more complex menu. And again, more complexity breeds more workload for drivers. And so what we're talking about is a simple menu would be something where it's very shallow. So there are only 3 to 5 options that you have to remember while driving down the road, hearing these options that you have to be able to recall which option you want and what number it corresponded to. And you shouldn't have to scroll through a touch screen in the center of your dash in order to do that. Okay, so simpler is better in this context. And then we looked at Apple Siri, and of course, she performed the worst of them all, although none of you are surprised by that, I'm sure. And so in the third phase, we had a couple key questions. And these were questions that our critics, and every research team has critics, right? No research is perfect. There are always weaknesses of any research study, and ours was no different. And so some of the most common questions we got included, does practice matter? So yeah, we get it, AAA. People get in these cars and they've not driven them before. And yes, we know you gave them some training, which you typically don't get from the dealer when you buy or rent a car. But still, like after you use it for a while, it's not as demanding anymore. It becomes easier because you kind of figure it out. Okay, so we looked at that, and what we found was after training, which you don't get from the dealer, and a week of using it, that when they came back and got put through the tests again, that they did perform slightly better, but the trends were the same. And so you can't practice away cognitive distraction. It can go down a little bit, but it's still high. It's not significantly different. And then does age matter? So how many people have heard claims that young people, teenagers, are super multitaskers? They're just so much better with technology that they can multitask. Somehow multitasking is real for them, but it's not for the rest of us. And so those were questions. And then also if you think about the aging of America and the fact that as we age, we slow down a little bit in terms of our mental processing. And so that could have a factor as well. And so we looked at this issue, and what we found was, yes, age does matter. But young people aren't better at interacting with these systems, these technologies, than the rest of us. It's just that as we age, we have a harder time doing that. So, the average middle-aged driver is no less successful at interacting or more successful interacting with these technologies as a teenager. But when we're 55, 65 and up, we have a much harder time. And so the workload or demands that we would experience as drivers will be much lower than what somebody who's 55, 65 and up would experience. So that shouldn't be too surprising. We would have expected that. And then the last was we wanted to look at digital voice assistants. So Microsoft Cortana, Google's digital voice app assistant, and then also Apple Siri. And our motivation for doing that was because the automakers were working with these organizations to develop technologies in their dashboards to allow more streamlined use of your actual handheld phone. All the apps that are on your phone, you can interact with all those apps using voice commands through your dash. Again, the intent isn't a bad one. We would rather them use voice commands to do it than to resort to the manual phone. So I get the logic, right? But if the demands on the driver are greater, trying to interact with this technology that isn't perfect, are we really better off? So we looked at that, and I'll show you the results here. So you can see Microsoft Cortana at the end was the worst, Apple Siri was in the middle, and Google Now was the best performer. So lower is better. Lower means lower demands on the driver, okay? And then you can see some of the other infotainment systems that we tested as well. And then a surprise finding in this body of work was that there are lasting effects of mental or cognitive distraction. So how many of us, and be honest, I'll do it, I'll be honest too. When I'm at a stop sign or at a red light or I'm sitting in traffic, what's the first thing we do? We check our phone. Everybody does it. But what we've learned in this study was that it takes roughly 27 seconds for the impairing effects of mental distraction interacting with these technologies. It takes about 27 seconds for them to subside and for you to sort of reach baseline again. And it's that whole situational awareness thing. So once you put down the phone, and now the light's green because maybe somebody honked at you, and you're like, okay, I get it. And you set the phone down and you proceed through the intersection. You're through that intersection and you're still just as distracted as you were when you had your phone taped to your face. So it's that period of time where you've set this task aside and now you're trying to focus on driving again. All right, where am I? What are the hazards in this environment? Is anybody gonna blow through this intersection? Where am I going? What's going on? 27 seconds to sort of figure that out. So that's really important. The implication is just because you're at a red light, stop sign, or in congested traffic doesn't mean you should pick up your phone, because you are still distracted even once you set it down. So our recommendations for industry are reasonable. Okay, we're not being crazy. We're not asking federal regulators to regulate their business. We think that people who design these technologies have the special expertise and training to handle solutions to it, not people on Capitol Hill who have no experience in this space whatsoever. And they would never be able to keep up with changing technology anyway. So we have given recommendations to the industry players whose products we tested before we promoted those results in the media, to give them a chance to ask questions and become familiar with the results, and so that we could talk about, without media calls coming in the background, about what the implications of this are. Why are the results what they are, and what can we do to make them better moving forward? So design simpler systems. So things like the hardware used, so mic placement and speakers. Both the placement of those things in the vehicle and also the quality of those technologies matter. Also, how quiet it is inside the car. So you've been in maybe some higher end cars and it's just a quiet ride, okay? And then you're in like a Jeep Wrangler and it's really loud. Well, that influences the degree to which these voice recognition technologies are gonna get what you say correct, that they're gonna understand your command correctly, or that they're gonna transcribe your message accurately. And then we talked about complexity and simplicity through menus, and listening versus listening and composing messages are all ways to do that. And that the interactions should be no more demanding than listening to the radio or an audiobook. Reasonable expectation. For motorists, hands-free is not risk-free. You should limit the use of these technologies if they're not related to the core task of driving. And just because technology allows you to do A, B, or C doesn't mean that you should. when you're driving 70 miles an hour down the road. Upcoming research, so one of the big weaknesses of all of this work has been that we don't understand what the crash risk is associated with being mentally distracted versus just distracted in general. So most things that we do behind the wheel that distract us involve not just visual or manual or mental. Almost everything we do involves multiple of those, if not all three, okay? And it's hard to tease that apart. And so we didn't know what the crash risk was associated with just being mentally distracted. So we're doing a study to try to understand that, which will be really helpful. And then we're also looking at the crash risk of smartphone use while driving. So you probably heard the stats earlier. What is the crash risk associated with using a cell phone while you're driving? 4 times, quadruples your crash risk. Those findings are 10 years old or more. And what were cell phones like 10 years ago? It's like the one that our grandmas still use, right? It's like the flip phone. You have to push the button 3 times to get to the letter you want when you text. So there's that. So we don't have cell phones, we have smartphones now. And then we have advanced driver assistance systems, the stuff Dr. Kidd is going to talk about, that make us safer. Vehicles are protecting us from ourselves in some ways. And then also infrastructure is different. Now we have rumble strips and stripes. We're not paying attention and the road reminds us, hey, focus, you're about to leave your lane. So things are a lot different now. And odds are that the crash risk that is associated with using a smartphone probably isn't today what it was then. That's important to know. So we're doing a study there. And then the Center for Distracted Driving Research is sort of formalizing this multi-phase series of research that we've been doing, looking at cognitive distraction. And so some of the ways that it'll change is that we're going to take our rating scale for mental distraction and we're going to fold into that both visual distraction and also time on task, right? So if you do something that's only a little bit dangerous, but you do it all the time, it's pretty bad in the long run, versus doing something that's really dangerous but only for a second. So exposure matters. And so we're looking at time on task and we're looking at visual and cognitive, all folded into the scale. So it's a more comprehensive look at how distracting interacting with different technologies can be. And we'll also understand the relative contribution of these different forms of distraction, which would be important to know. And then we're also not aborting our study of infotainment systems and the use of voice commands, but we are going to start looking at other things like the technologies in the cars today that save us from ourselves. Lane keeping, adaptive cruise control, forward crash mitigation, all these technologies that you'll hear about in a moment have potential distraction associated with those as well. Sometimes, in fact, a majority of the time, when there is a technology put into a vehicle, when it is tested by the automaker, it is tested by the small team of engineers who created it, okay? And so they're going to test it according to how it was designed to be used. But you put me behind the wheel of a car to interact with technology, and I didn't design it, and I don't know what the limits of it are. I don't know how it's supposed to work, and when it stops working. I don't know when it kicks in and when it kicks off. Then you put a human behind the wheel of a car with a technology that isn't familiar with it, and the results can be very different. So that's problematic. And so we'll be looking at what some of the potential unintended consequences are from a distraction standpoint of technologies meant to help us, so that industry can address those things in future iterations of those technologies, not to stop putting those technologies in cars, but to make them better. Also things like gesture control and heads-up display technology are things that we'll be able to study in this center as well. So those are things we're going to be looking at, and we're not, like I said before, aborting the infotainment system, especially because Apple and Android are making it easy where you just step into your car and automatically everything's synced up, and if there's an app on your phone, you can interact with it using voice commands instead of manually. So we can't abort our work on this. We have to keep chipping away at it, and we will. So I'll stop there and happy to take questions at the very end. Thank you.
Kidd?
All right, great. So we spent a lot of today talking about cell phone use specifically, and my hope is to broaden that discussion to other types of activities drivers are engaged in, hopefully provide you with some perspective about the relative frequency of the different things drivers may do while behind the wheel. So first off, as you heard this morning, we know actually quite a bit about cell phones and how they impair driving performance. We know some about what the risks are with different types of cell phone use, and we know a lot about how often drivers engage in different types of cell phone use. So every year, the government has observers stationed at controlled intersections during the daytime, and they record when drivers are talking on the phone or manipulating some type of handheld electronic device. And through that, they get a national estimate about the proportion or the prevalence of these activities among US drivers during the daytime. And so what you can see in this figure here is that between 2000 and 2005, it's the gold line, the proportion of drivers who were talking on the phone actually rapidly increased from about 3% to 6%. But it's held fairly stable since then until about 2012, it's actually started decreasing. Now that red line, that's manipulating a handheld device. So that includes texting, but also other types of interactions. And so while it was really low back in 2005, you can see there's a steady increasing trend. And up until recently, where we see in 2015, it's at 2% of drivers observed were engaged in this behavior. And among drivers of the youngest age group, between 16 and 24, that was actually about 4%. So it's actually fairly high among those drivers. So while the overall proportion of people interacting with the phone from these national estimates hasn't really changed lately, what type of activities that they're engaged in has. Okay, and so we talked about exposure a little bit, and another aspect of exposure is the risk carried with it. And so manipulating a phone instead of talking on a phone has very different risk. But again, cell phone use is only one aspect of the problem, only one thing that drivers do behind the wheel. So we went out in the Northern Virginia area and drove around, just recorded what some drivers were doing. And now this is a cherry-picked sample, so it's not representative of what's going on, but it does give you an idea of some of the weirder things that drivers were doing. All right, so eating and smoking at the same time. The jar pickle thing is really fascinating to me. And then you had the woman using the phone, but I think she was actually using it as a mirror to check her hair or something else. So that's one of the things with the phone, is that with applications or with the cameras on it, you can use it in a number of different fashions. So we actually conducted an observational study where we had people positioned on the side of the road in 4 communities in Northern Virginia to get an idea about the prevalence of a variety of behaviors that drivers were engaged in. And this graph shows the proportion of drivers, we observed over 16,000, the proportion of those drivers that were engaged in different things. So 5% of them were just holding a phone, okay? So not interacting with it, not talking on it, just having it in their hand. 4% were talking on the phone, 3% were eating or drinking, and then you see just under 3% were talking when a passenger was in the car, okay? So passenger conversation, and that was followed by manipulating the cell phone. So cell phone use was common. It was among the most common type of behaviors drivers engaged in, but eating or drinking and talking with a passenger was also frequent. Now, to further complicate the issue beyond the fact that there's a number of ways people can distract themselves, is the fact that the types of things drivers engage in is often influenced by the driving context or other situational factors. So for instance, and we heard from one of the driving instructors or educators down here in front, that the number of decisions you make depends upon what the driving situation is. And that actually does also influence what drivers are doing. So in the same study, we had people positioned in 4 different driving situations. People going through along a straight stretch of road, people going through a green light at a controlled intersection, but also people stopped at that light when it was red, and then people going through a roundabout. And these were all done on the same stretch of road, hoping to kind of control for other types of differences that may be going on. Now, these are 3 behaviors in specific, and you can see for the proportion of people talking on the phone that we observed was about 4% in each of these different situations. Now, manipulating a cell phone, you can see that was right under 3% for people we saw on straightaways and who were going through an intersection during a green light. But when people were stopped, that jumped up to almost 4%. Now, roundabouts are unique in the sense that it takes a little more attention, right, to navigate a roundabout. You have to judge a gap as you merge into the roundabout, and it takes a lot of vehicle control, so steering the wheel while you're moving around it. And so 1% of people we saw in roundabouts were manipulating a phone, which is still surprising, to be honest, but it is lower. So these more demanding roadway situations do influence what people are doing. Similar pattern for eating or drinking. A lot of that went on when people were stopped, less so when people were moving. Now, we heard this morning about passengers and how passenger conversation can be distracting, but passengers can also help you as another set of eyes, right? Now, what's interesting is passengers also influence what you're doing behind the wheel other than driving. And in this study, we compared solo drivers to drivers who had a passenger in the car, and overall, drivers were engaged in at least one type of secondary behavior to the same extent, so about a quarter of drivers observed. But the behaviors they were engaged in varied. So solo drivers, you saw more cell phone use, holding or talking. Drivers who had a passenger in the car, not surprisingly, were doing less of that but talking to the passenger, okay? So these type of activities, though, carry different risk. Some of the risk we know, most really, we don't know much about. So in an effort to try to understand crash risk more, we recently used a new set of data. It's a naturalistic driving set of data, so they basically have video cameras inside people's cars recording all of daily driving, as well as information from vehicle sensors. And this was with over 3,000 drivers in the US who were followed for 3 years between 2010 and 2013. So any kind of impact that that car had was considered a crash. Now, most of the impacts were actually not what we would consider a crash because it was with a curb, maybe a squirrel, but we looked specifically at those that were severe enough and from a kinematic standpoint or from an estimated dollar value that would be police reportable. And so we looked at the risk of these type of police reportable crashes for 4 different behaviors relative to when drivers were not doing anything visibly, okay? So no visible distractions. And you can see for talking on a phone, the percent change in the risk of a police reportable crash was almost doubled. Now, it wasn't statistically increased, but it was really close. So you're talking about basically a 2-fold increase. Manipulating a phone, however, you see a 400% increase in the risk of a police reportable crash relative to when people weren't doing anything else. Eating or drinking, interacting with a radio, HVAC, other kind of thing built into the car, no real change. Now, like I said, when people aren't doing one activity, it's not the case that they just stop doing anything. There's other things that they possibly do instead to substitute. So we looked at the risk when people were engaged in an activity relative to when they were just driving, but also maybe doing something else. And so what you can see is talking on a phone, there's really no change in risk. So other activities that drivers were engaging in kind of carried the same risk. Manipulating a phone, however, you still see a substantial increase in risk of this police reportable crash based on these data. So it's pretty clear that manipulating a phone carries with it a substantial amount of crash risk. And so do these other behaviors to some extent. It just depends kind of what you're comparing it to. Given the fact that there's a ton of different ways that drivers can become distracted, we feel it's important to have countermeasures that address the entire problem, so a holistic solution. One type of technology we feel can do this is front crash prevention technology. It can mitigate or prevent crashes where a driver's not paying attention, as well as help deal with other possible contributing factors to crashes. And so I'm going to show a short video, hopefully it doesn't jump around, to give you an idea about what front crash prevention technology is.
I gotcha. Oh, you can count on me. 1, 2, 3, I'll be there. Oh, I know when I need it, I can count on you. Like 4, 3, 2.
Remember when only Dad could save the day? Sorry.
That's what
Auto emergency braking on the all-new Genesis from Hyundai.
All right, so front crash prevention technology, that's our term for forward collision warning and warning with automatic braking. Okay, so you saw in the video there, the teenage driver sees a pretty girl walking down the street. Attention strays away from the forward roadway, but the technology there is there to issue a warning to hopefully redirect his attention forward. If he doesn't respond, there's automatic braking. And what we've seen is that this technology, for vehicles equipped with it, there's a very substantial reduction in crash involvement for both front-to-rear crashes and those front-to-rear crashes involving third-party injury, okay? So when we look at vehicles fit with forward collision warning, we see a 26% reduction in rear end strike involvement, and then a 20% reduction for strikes involving third-party injury. But then when you look at those vehicles fit with both warning and automatic braking, and this is relative to those same vehicles without the technology, about a 50% decrease for rear end strikes, but almost a 60% decrease for those involving injury. And that's because the technology doesn't rely on the driver to apply the brakes, it does it on its own, okay? So you can hopefully at least mitigate scrub off speed, which reduces injury. But even though this technology is available now, you can buy it in a Honda Civic, very affordable car. It takes a long time for technology to penetrate the fleet. Vehicles are around for a while, so it takes time for the fleet to flip over. So we don't project this technology to be standard in vehicles, 80% of vehicles in the fleet till 2034. So it's important when trying to address the issue of distracted driving to look at not only long-term solutions, but short-term solutions such as legislation, intermediate solutions such as changes to roadway infrastructure like roundabouts, rumble strips, things that keep drivers engaged that we can do, and other solutions to address the problem. So I'll be happy to take your questions at the end.
Boy, I have to tell you, I hate following all these smart people. I really do, because they got all the stats and they have all of the information. But here's the thing I want you all to think about. When we're talking about behavior today and using the smartphone in our cars, the biggest problem is we're enabling. You can't change a behavior if you continually enable it. I mean, think about it. All right? So before I go through the rest of my presentation, I want you to keep that in mind, that to change the behavior, okay, we got to stop enabling the action. And that's what we're doing, okay? So Texas A&M did a study a while back, and they were talking about the agreement of it is a problem and they shouldn't be texting and driving. And I'm going to kind of go through my presentation kind of fast because I'd rather answer any questions. And I know Terry's dying to know what the results of this survey or this study was that we did. I know he wants to know. Okay, and it's the very last slide. Okay? Okay. So I basically am going to talk about Texas, but Texas is one of only 4 states in the country that doesn't have a statewide ban on texting and driving in the country. And from a law enforcement standpoint, it's pretty hard to enforce texting and driving if it's not a primary offense. And in most states, it's a secondary offense, okay? And how are you going to be able to see someone texting and driving? So we have issues to address when we're talking about texting and driving. So the scope of the problem is, if you listen to everybody that's done research, and I know you guys have spent millions of dollars on this research, okay? The one thing that they've all said is one word that always sticks out to me when we're talking about technology and research. It's all based on observation. It's either with a camera in the car, right? Would you agree? A bunch of students standing over the bridge, looking down, taking pictures. The universities or people coming in and going, hey, look at these pictures. What do you think they were doing? Right? It's all observation. When you really stop and think about it, we really don't know what somebody's doing on the phone unless it's next to their ear or you could see them texting on the phone, okay? So the other problem we have, and this is a really hard screen, and I thought I'd change this, but I guess I didn't. But let me tell you what this is. When you talk about crash reports today, I don't know if all of you know all the different crash reports in the country, but guess what? There's no field in a crash report that identifies the law enforcement officer or the individual in the crash to report texting and driving or distracted driving, okay? Now, for those of you that work with Muck, I'm not sure, how many people know about Muck in here? Wow, really? 1? Nobody else? 2? All right, so for those 2, who know exactly what MUCK is. MUCK is a group working with GHSA and the state highway safety offices and some other professionals about coming up with some standardized fields to be put in on crash reports in the future, okay? So they have, in this new format, specific fields to be put on crash reports that would identify the distracted driving, okay? But who contributes to distracted driving? Let's talk about it. The automotive companies, the technology companies, and app developers like myself, hardware manufacturers, and people, family, friends, everybody in here contributes. How many times do you know your son, your daughter, your spouse is driving and you make a telephone call to them when they're driving to stop off at the grocery store and pick up a gallon of milk? We all contribute to that fact, okay? So, to me, here's where we're at. The automobile replaced the horse. Can the smartphone replace the car? And the answer is it's going to happen, okay? And it really is. And if you don't think so, think about where it's going. A lot of you don't understand, but how many of you know about IoT? Raise your hand. A few of you. Okay, if you don't know what IoT is, it is the future. It is the future of technology. It is the future of distracted driving, okay? Because you're going to be able to drive down the highway and look in your refrigerator and see inside your refrigerator and see that you don't have a gallon of milk, okay? And that is happening today. If you go to the Home Depot, if you go to Lowe's, you go to any one of those stores, go in and look at the refrigerators, and Samsung has come out with a screen on the front of the refrigerator that has a camera that goes into your refrigerator, that ties to your phone, and it shows you what's in your refrigerator. Okay? That's pretty significant. The other thing, I have all these light bulbs in my house that I can control from my cell phone right here. I live in Houston. And I can turn them on, I can turn them off, I can dim them, whatever I want to do, I can change the color. This is what's going on, okay? What's going to happen is, as you talk about the autonomous vehicle and the self-driving vehicle, what you're really talking about is a hub. It's the hub, and it's going to drive the industry. And it's going to become a bigger problem because you're going to have people sitting in these cars relying on this smart car to drive you from point A to point B safely. And you're going to take all responsibility away from the individual in the vehicle while they're playing on their tablet or their smartphone or whatever else. That's IoT, okay? So it is going to tie to your smartphone, other vehicles, transportation systems. This is all a part of the problem with distracted driving. Now, why? It's money. Distracted driving for the industry is big money. We are going to become a data-centric society, especially in the auto industry, if we don't figure out how to fix this problem, okay? Look at Telsa, look at BMW. I can drive my BMW right now and take my hands off the car, and it drives for me, okay? The bigger problem that we have, and this is why I brought these little pieces up here, there's two parts to this problem. We have the cars that are older cars that don't have the new technology in them, okay? And then we have the new cars. And when you look at the older cars, you have, what are these? You remember these? How many people still use one of these? Oh, okay. But now, these are pretty sophisticated now. If you know, you can hook up a back rear camera to them. You got it, it'll record while you're driving, which probably most of you don't want to be recorded when you're driving. Okay, it tells you when you go out of the line. Okay, and then these are what are called, how many people know what dongles are? Good, good. Dongles for the old car is going to be the savior for us if we can ever get this perfected. This is a dongle. This is something that's going to tie into the old cars, okay? That is what's going to tell us how you drive, where you go, how fast, all those crazy things we do, okay? So what's happened is the distraction has become the entertainment or infotainment center, okay, in the industry. And what we got to do is figure out a way to record that information and have a reason for people not watching TV, listening to music, checking their phone, whatever. So let's redefine what the automobile really is in distracted driving. It's a cross investment between automotive and technology companies, and it's blurring the definition. Why? Look at Telsa, look at BMW, look at Fiat. All of these companies are partnering with what? Technology companies. Every one of them. And this is going to be a big problem. A recent study by Virginia Tech, and it was referenced here, I think, earlier today, they did a 5-year study. They had 3,500 participants, and they spent $50 million. $50 million for a study. And it was putting cameras in the car, paying the participants a certain amount of money to give us the statistics of people are actually using their cell phones or smartphones in a car and driving. $50 million. This is a big business. I don't know about you guys, but I can think of a lot of better ways to spend $50 million than putting in a phone and a camera in a car, okay? That's actually a photo of what it looked like, okay? Texas A&M, they did a recent study a couple of years ago, and they talked about the percentages of what the risks were for respondents in texting and driving, and this is something that is ongoing. Research is something that we've really tried to work with. So here's the solution. Okay, and this is something that's going to be available in February, and something that I think you all are going to be very interested in. It's called IFIQ. And what it is it's a library of tools that we can put on your cell phone, and we can literally record everything that you do. Okay? We can tell you how many times you were in Facebook. We can tell you how many times you SMS'd. We can tell you how many times you were on Snapchat. We are literally live recording your entire action and every action on the entire phone while you're driving, okay? And we're really proud to announce that we're going to be working with Texas A&M on this starting next year. So this is a big project for us. Here's what we can get. And I don't know if you can read this, but this is a highway. And if you look at it, it looks like you see all these different things. We can tell you the location of the vehicle, the latitude, the longitude, the time, the highway, the distance covered, total vehicles in a violation of parameters, everything on the car, on the phone. Okay? So we could do individual driver, time, and day. This is what technology can do for us today. We don't need the cameras. We don't need the recorders. We can literally take it directly off of the phone. Okay? So what we did is we're playing with this right now, and we're doing a current study with the Texas CR2 crash report. We have 500 participants that we're taking the CR2 crash report and importing the IFIQ data set and pulling from different databases for weather, latitude, longitude, so that the typical report will only have to have 4 fields filled in by the driver or the individual. So it's a pretty sophisticated system. So do these apps really work, texting and driving? And one of the things that I need to talk about is how many apps out there do texting and driving. There's probably 80 to 100 that are within reason out there to prevent you from texting and driving. If anybody wants a list, I'll be more than happy to send you. I've reviewed all of them. But most of them don't work. And the reason for that, yes, Gwen? Oh. One of the reasons that they don't work is because it's too expensive to maintain them. Okay? A typical app that we use today for texting and driving, if you want to start to put all the bells and whistles in it, will cost you anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000. Okay? And when you look at what most of the apps that are out there for texting and driving are, they're usually nonprofits. And nonprofits can't afford a $50,000 or $100,000 app. All right? So different types of distracted driving apps. There's Teens in the Driver's Seat. It was a study that was worked with a pilot program that we talked about with students. There's Self-Control. It's an app that works specifically with fleets and individuals, but it's more geared towards the fleet. Lifesaver, talk to your parents, talk to your kids. It's a really good app to work with. And Drive Alive, it's a part of the PAD system. So there's multiple apps out there, but this is something that you need to look at, and when you're looking at these apps, understand what they do and what they don't do, because a lot of them don't do the same thing. You know, the problem with the technology is, does the user have to volunteer, turn the app on? Yes or no? If they don't turn it on, it doesn't work, okay? Some of them will only work if you go a certain speed, okay? They activate when you go 5 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour, 15 miles an hour. So there's lots of different reasons for that, and part of that is because of the requirements of the iOS for Apple or for Android. There's different issues with those, okay? So, Terry, we did a pilot program with some students, and we got some information about what they did and what they didn't do. And part of it was a rewards-based system. We thought, well, if we could put something out there to see what would keep students from texting and driving, what would it be? And so we came up with a couple of prizes, and we had a tablet, we gave away a phone, we gave away free food. It was pretty interesting. So the first week that we implemented it, 69.2% of the users drove 2,600 miles with the application on. Those that didn't, 30%, or approximately 1,100 miles. After the first week, and we did the next 12 weeks, 97% used the app. And this was a volunteer basis. So this is a pretty significant number because we knew real time what they were doing. Okay? Then you see where the percentages where it dropped from 30 to 2.93%. So then what we wanted to know is, what happens if we take away the incentive? What if we took away the prizes? What if we took away the money? What if we took away the food? What would happen? Okay? Here's what happened. 98% the first week kept using it, and then after the next 8 weeks, it was 94%. So we did see a dip in if there's not a rewards-based system for them to use the app. So from that, what we've detected is that we have to be able to figure out what are the best features and why do people use them. And this is kind of what we're at. The block the calls, texting, and SMS. Those are the typical ones that everybody talks about. Okay? Emergency contact list, reward system, but they're not all the same. So you have to be really careful if you're looking for these type of applications for your family or your friends. Okay? Let's talk about smartphone policy. I think this is a real important one because we talked about it today. A smartphone policy is only going to work if you can enforce it. And to be quite honest with you, if you've got a fleet and you got people that are driving a phone and using a smartphone on a company vehicle, you have no way of knowing if they're using it or not. And they know that. We're human beings. If you use the library set, which everybody will be able to have, that will give us an idea of what they're doing when they're driving. And I'm almost done. So here's the different types of ways you can do it. You can use the dongle, you can use software, you can use third-party hardware applications or hardware devices as well. And we have a new thing called the NFC chip, which is an RT chip. It's about the size of a dime that we can stick into a car anywhere, and it will prevent you from texting and driving on your phone. This is some more statistics. I don't want to bore you with statistics, but there's a lot there. And then just here's some other studies, and I'll be more than happy to send this to anybody that wants to look at the stuff. So I'm done. Okay?
Great. Well, 3 great presentations on terms of what's happening with technology in our vehicles. And so what we want to do now is we have about 20 minutes. Well, we want to spend some time and open it up for questions. And we are going to have some microphones that we'll have around the room here. And so if you'll wait till we get the microphone to you so that we can hear the question that's being asked. And Gwen, I think we had a hand raised back here in the back. And so we'll open it up for questions here for a few minutes.
For any of the speakers, can you hear me? Have any cities or states updated their distracted driving ordinances based on voice activation software within vehicles to address these new challenges?
So I can't tell you if there are localities that have done that, but I know that as we've learned more through our work and the work we're doing through the AAA Foundation, that our recommendations to our clubs and therefore to local governments include that sort of eye towards that detail and watching on carve-outs for certain technologies that industry will work hard to make sure are in those laws. So we're becoming smarter as advocates on that and working to prevent those carve-outs where they exist.
So there's certain states too that have, I guess, revisited the initial texting laws to expand it or refine the language to include more potential activities that people could engage in, not just sending or receiving text-based messages, but maybe navigation or any kind of interaction involving the phone. There's other states like West Virginia, I think also includes eating and drinking. So there is some activity in the area, but I don't think there's as much as it was back in 2009, 2010.
It's still very open. I mean, most states at the state level are having a problem identifying it because it's a political issue. So you're seeing a lot more of the cities and even counties now implementing specific ordinances. And if you look at it from a national level, you'll see a ton of city and county ordinances being put in place to do that. And usually, case in point, if it's in a work zone or it's in a school zone, it's usually a primary offense. So you're seeing a lot more action in that area. But globally or holistically overall, no, it's not. It hasn't done anything at this point.
Okay. Laura Lee?
Yeah, I would like to know about a little bit more about the 27-second lasting effects when you pick up your phone at an intersection, and what we should be telling youth in our training programs about that.
So did you have a specific question other than how to educate consumers about it? Okay, so what we've been saying, just what I iterated to all of you is that that just because you're at a red light or a stop sign or in traffic congestion conditions, that it is not a reason to pick up your phone and interact with it, because even when you set it down, you're still distracted for up to 27 seconds. So just discouraging motorists from engaging in that activity when it's seemingly safe, at times when most people would assume that it's safe to do it.
What do we tell them the distraction
It's a mental or cognitive distraction. It's your brain trying to let go of what it was doing with the phone and focus on what you're having it do, which is operate the motor vehicle. It takes some time to sort of regain your situational awareness as a driver versus somebody who's interacting with the phone. You bet.
We have a question back here.
Yeah, that's for AAA. How receptive have auto manufacturers been to y'all's recommendations? I mean,
So it's changed over the course of the last few years, and I would say just a concise response to describe where it is now is that sometimes you don't have to be liked to be listened to. So in the beginning, we were ignored until the amount of media that we got and attention, both from federal regulators as well, is what made them stop ignoring us. And the fact that we were providing the results of this work to them, if their product was evaluated, weeks in advance of our public release and promotion of the findings, I think helps, because it shows that we're really trying to help you here. We're not trying to hurt you. This isn't a gotcha. This is meant to be constructive. And to be doing that year after year after year, I think has built our credibility with them. And so while they still probably wish that we weren't doing this work, they're much more apt today versus 4 years ago to sort of listen carefully to our recommendations and to come out to Salt Lake City at the University of Utah to provide feedback on the methods that will be used in the next wave of the research. So we're working with them to help improve their products, and they are working with us to make our methods stronger and stronger moving forward. So now we're working together in both directions, which is not the way that it was in the beginning.
I'd like to say that, I mean, I work with the auto industry quite a bit, and to me, it's a chicken and an egg thing. They look at it as a moneymaker, to be quite honest with you. All this technology just drives up the cost of a car, and they're making big money off of it. And they're realizing that they can collect a whole lot of data on the driver and the passengers and everything else. That is a major problem, and that is something that we're going to have to eventually address. If you look at the Chevy Volt, or I think it's the Volt or the Cruise, where if a teenager is driving now or something, they can turn down the radio and things like that. But I think the other part of that question is, when I say chicken and the egg, is it's going to take a class action lawsuit, and it's going to happen. The question is going to be, is it going to be against the auto manufacturer? Is it going to be against the wireless carrier? Or is it going to be against the mobile app? But it is going to happen. It's not a matter of will it, it's going to be when. And when that happens, I think you're going to see the auto industry have to really address the issue of distracted driving. But I think from a research standpoint, they're very interested in participating because it helps the cause. But when you really look at the bottom line, you don't see any of these auto manufacturers trying to get this technology out of the car. So it's a problem.
See, we had a question over here.
Yeah, this question's for Dr. Kidd, but any insight from any of the panel members? One of the studies that you cited showed that the risk rate, or the risk of using a cell phone to talk rather than manipulating the device led to like a 100% increase in your relative risk of collision, but it wasn't statistically significant. What is your interpretation of that finding? You know, it looked like it doubled the risk, but not statistically significant. Was that a lack of statistical power or a lack of a real effect?
So, you know, the Institute was involved in some of the early work, epidemiological work, looking at trying to quantify the crash risk associated with cell phones, right? And we found a 4-fold increase in crash risk. There's been the naturalistic driving approaches come since then, and there's been kind of mixed findings there as well. They've certainly conflicted with what we found early on. The study that I present information on that you mentioned as well had one of the limitations prior was that crashes aren't frequent. If you put cameras in cars, it takes a lot of miles to get enough crashes of substantial severity to really say something. This one had a lot of crashes. A very small subset were those that were substantial severity to say something about it. So part of it was a power issue. To be honest with you. Now, those early epidemiological studies, the one we did in Australia was looking at people who went to the ER. The other one done in Canada was looking at people who had to take their car to a collision claims center. Okay, so it could very well be that for the more severe crashes resulting in injury or substantial vehicle tow-away damage to the vehicle, that talking on a phone has a higher risk than when you're talking about some of these more minor incidents. It's unclear. But certainly it's a numbers thing, but it could also have to do with the severity of the crash itself too.
And I'd like to say something about on the crash side of it. I mean, part of the problem is we don't have a good system in place in any of the states to record the actual action of the distracted driving at the time of the crash. So, you know, I mean, it's kind of hard to interview someone who's dead at a crash scene. Wait, were you using your cell phone? Okay, or if they're in a serious injury and they're in the ambulance or something like that. So it's really hey, on the honor system, were you using your cell phone when you got into this accident? I mean, so there's going to have to be a push at some point because law enforcement can't continue just to show up for every crash, and then there's going to have to be a way for us to better record the crashes and identify them as a distraction. And I think, from a research standpoint, I think they would find it a whole lot better if they could actually use real data versus having to scour 10,000 crash reports and look at the narrative in the crash reports that says distracted driving using a cell phone was part of it. I think it's going to have to be a part of the future if we want to identify and stop this problem.
Another question here.
We just got a data set in Austin that said 26% of all the crashes involved distracted driving, but only 2% of those were serious injuries or fatalities. That suggests to me that, one, we're under-recording distracted driving, but two, people are being distracted at slower speeds. I think that's what the data says. Do you have any feedback on that? Because, you know, we're looking at fatalities. They're very small numbers relatively to get good data from. But when we're looking at all crashes and we got 26% distracted, that should be telling us something.
I mean, I'm not familiar with the data that you're talking about, but certainly distracted, affected crashes are severely underreported. We've done work at the AAA Foundation that involves putting cameras in cars, and what I think one of the values of that type of research is you see what's happening in the vehicle at the moments before the crash occurs. And what we learned in that study of teen drivers is that in 60% of crashes involving a teen driver involved some form of distracted driving. And I think worth noting is that at least in that study, the single greatest form of distraction involved in those crashes wasn't the cell phone, it was interacting with peer passengers in the car. And the second most common distractor was manipulating a cell phone. So, but the point is that federal statistics had a much lower estimate of the number of teen driver crashes that involved distracted driving, and our study, which actually shows what's happening in the vehicle, estimated it was more around 60% of those crashes. So your point is well taken, it's severely underreported. How you fix that,
The second part of the question is, our data suggests that most distracted driving crashes are supposed to be crashes. Did you see that in your information?
Most of the crashes in our study were on like 2-lane highways, and involved running off the road, those types of things, or rear-ending people. Certainly, I think that in congested traffic conditions, that there are probably many minor crashes that involve distracted driving, but they're not reported to police departments, and there may or may not be a claim involved. So they're much lower severity, and people aren't being injured, and there's not a lot of damage. But I would imagine that's very common, for sure.
So I just want to add on. I mean, so obviously some of the information that I showed suggests that when people are stopped, right, it's more prevalent. So it could be the case that when they're going slower, it's also more prevalent. But you also have to consider the reasons why people are going slower is possibly there's more congestion and opportunity for conflict. Distraction, right, depending upon what activity you're engaged in. Typically, the result is the strongest finding across all studies is that there's a reduced reaction time, okay? So that's not always going to lead to, I mean, at those speeds, it's very hard to have a severe injury, right? And typically when you have a fatal crash, so distractions are involved in those, but there's a host of factors too. So in addition to the reporting issues and things like that as well. But to be honest, you know, even when you have the cameras in the car, the crashes that are being recorded for further analysis, those are dependent upon the ways that we can scour, I think petabytes of data is the term, which it usually relies on sudden changes in accelerations, okay? So when you look, those things are like hard brakings or front to rear type of crashes. It doesn't necessarily capture moments when you're looking at near crashes, right, where for instance, when I was leaving the airport yesterday, I was in my rental car immediately out. I stopped at a yellow light. As I was slowing for the yellow light, the guy behind me accelerated, whipped past me, ran the red light, honked the horn at me, offensive, and then, you know, but that was honest to God a near crash, right? But that wouldn't be recorded. So there's, you know, while it's great to have better data, and there's hopefully new ways we can do it, we work with the tools that we have. Hopefully we can sort of converge on what we think is the best read of that data.
Yeah, and just one final comment. Distracted driving affected crashes aside, the more dense a population becomes, the less severe the crashes become, but the more of them that occur. So we already know that. A majority of fatal crashes occur in rural 2-lane highways.
And I would like to add to what you said about the crashes and underreporting. I mean, the technology in the phone today is there. We can determine the speed. We can determine everything about that vehicle. You know, and if you put this little thing in the car, you can even get a whole lot more. I think, you know, when you look at the crashes, a lot of crashes today are not reported, period. They're reported to the insurance industry, okay, and the claim is paid, but it's never recorded, all right?
That's the problem we have today. And so, and I'm just going to talk about Texas, but all states have this problem. But when you have a CR2 crash report, when there's no law enforcement showing up, okay, a lot of times that data is not collected, okay, and we know nothing about it, and the person that does fill out that form, all right, has no clue what they're filling out. So the technology is there today for us to put that in the phone, literally put it in the phone and read the data from the dongle, read the data from the smartphone, okay, and fill in that application, okay? And what the state needs to do is to be able to require that to be sent so that we can record that data and then start looking at what we're talking about. And you tie that into the road system and say, okay, what are the factors? Was that in a work zone? Was that in a school zone? I mean, I could go on, I'm sorry. But that's where you gotta go to get the kind of data that you're talking about.
Okay. One last question here that wanted to ask maybe Jake or David if you all address. We've heard about a lot of technologies today. Just what do you think right now with the vehicles now, what's the most useful technology that we have on our vehicles, and what's the most likely to help us reduce distracted driving? And just y'all working in industry, you see what's coming out there, anything in the future that's coming in for us to keep looking for?
Okay, so this is the golden question.
That's
right?
it.
Yeah. So I'm going to speak about vehicles on the roadway now. So one thing, and this is from a vehicle technology's perspective, none of this is going to change distracted driving, but it can help cope with the outcome. Okay, electronic stability control. All right. So this technology is now standard on cars, has been for I think 5 years now, and what it does is help deal with when a driver overcorrects or the vehicle's not going in the direction that the driver intends it to go. Okay, so we do see instances or anecdotally that cases where someone may be distracted, they look up, there's some sort of situation they have to deal with, they overcorrect or they lose control. Electronic stability control can deal with this. So maybe informing drivers about the features on the vehicle that are more advanced that can help cope with not only when they're distracted, but other types of like black ice, other kind of loss of traction conditions is one way to go.
And I would say sort of pie in the sky would be the self-driving vehicle. And we're a lot closer to that being a reality than most people realize. And a lot of the limits to that are sort of regulatory and policy related, and at the crux of that is public acceptance. Are we as consumers ready for that, and what that would mean? And I think that there are a lot of problems with vehicle automation where, like all technology, it will sometimes fail, and then what? But even with that risk, the number of lives that would be saved with an imperfect technology is gonna far outweigh the lives lost when that technology does fail. And I'm talking about when vehicles are fully autonomous. This is a technology that's already being pilot tested in is it Pittsburgh? Uber?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is already happening. You can already take an Uber where a driver isn't operating the car at all. You can already do that today. You know that that's what you're getting into, and there's a driver there to monitor in case the technology fails. But the point is they're already pilot testing this, and Uber is already involved. So I think we're a lot closer to that happening than we might all realize or like to accept.
Right. Well, I'd like to thank Jake and David and Rick for sharing their experiences and the research that they're doing. And as you can see, this area is constantly evolving. And as traffic safety leaders, it's really important for us to keep up and know what technology is out there and how it's improving or maybe challenging our efforts to keep our roads safe. So join me in thanking our panel today.